because sometimes when systems are looking at things, they're looking at numbers. So if it benefits 80%, or then that's good enough.
Yes.
Problem is then they miss that 20%, and actually that's where the bulk of us and minority groups, are concentrated. I have a lot of respect for our volunteer sector, because it is a professional role. It's just that it's unpaid. But if you look at Amnesty International, the Red Cross, Salvation Army, probably the bulk of their people are unpaid, but they're there for the cause.
Yes.
They have this vision of the type of society that you want.
Absolutely.
And so if we get stuck on thinking about the money, then you're probably in the wrong place.
Yes.
Because, it's one thing to get into a job. The other thing is then you need to progress, because until you progress, our incomes don't improve, and then you don't close the gender pay gap. It's just be upfront with it. We, like, for example, we know that NGOs cannot pay as much as the state sector, but people love working for the NGOs. They do valuable work. So it's there. So, people can make decisions for themselves, but to hide it, to hide the pay scale is almost a purposeful encourage workers to recognize people's life experience, as well as lots of others, like in the voluntary sector, right? Which may or may not be reflected in a qualification that you have. The qualification is only part of actually the package that you bring. All the other experience and your can-do attitude, all of that is your total package.
Good morning, everyone. This is Nibedita, the Editorial Intern with Allied Justice Aotearoa, and it is with special excitement that I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Karanina Sumeo to our chat show. Dr. Karanina is the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner for the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, and she was also the Principal Practice Advisor at Oranga Tamariki, working to improve outcomes for Pacific children and families. Her previous roles include roles within the public sector, for instance, the Ministry of Social Development, Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs, Tertiary Education Commission, and the Auckland DHB. And now she is part of the legacy for gender and pay equality in Aotearoa. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karanina.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for being with us. So positively overwhelmed to see you, Dr. Karanina. I mean, I'm like, I'm just a fan of how you're so committed in, advocating for interests of children and minority women and the well-being of community. It's just amazing.
Well, we have to do it. Hey, we have to do it, because sometimes when systems are looking at things, they're looking at numbers. So if it benefits 80%, or then that's good enough.
Yes.
Problem is then they miss that 20%, and actually that's where the bulk of us and minority groups, are concentrated. So my constant thing is to get them to focus on the numbers that are not the average. Otherwise, they miss people like yourself, who are struggling. So it's really important that we have the opportunity, we use it,
So if I may just ask you, how did you move to becoming a civil servant? Because if I'm not wrong, you are from the science background.
Yes.
So,
Well, it was really interesting. So I was an industrial chemist, because I did my degree was in chemistry. Really loved that. And then during one lunch hour, I read the newspaper, and I came across this article about a 2-year-old toddler who was found deceased in her bed, a bare mattress. And it was the result of child abuse. I had never heard the term child abuse in my life. I had never heard the term social work in my life, but it changed me. I changed careers. Like the next year, I studied social work. After spending 4 years studying science and working in labs, it changed my life. And so that's how I shifted from science, then I suppose, to the social sciences. And I've done different roles, like policy and research and consultancy and stuff like that. But Yes, I think, when we go through we have our plans, right? Of course,
Mm.
in school, we have this idea, I'm going to do this and this, and then life happens,
Yes.
and you change your career. So, I mean, when you do get into your field, who knows? Maybe you might discover another field partway down, and then all of
Yeah.
that gets changed.
Yeah.
So it's just the
Yeah.
reality of life. Eh?
Absolutely. And then sometimes you're like, oh, this is going on, that is going on. Should I choose that? Should I choose that? And so many things happening around you.
Yes.
And you want to do something, you want to make an impact.
Yeah,
And yeah, you can't really stick to one field all the time,
that's right.
because things are evolving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, life evolves, communities evolve, cultures evolve, laws evolve, and we adapt. And I think, people like yourself who are leaders, inevitably you will get drawn into different causes in your journey, and you just adapt constantly, and you learn heaps, which is great.
Absolutely.
Hey,
Yes.
so your mind's going like this all the time. So it's a journey, and it's not always, as you know, there are ups and downs.
Mm,
And sometimes when there are downs, you think, is it ever going to go up? But it
mm,
does. It does go
mm.
up. So you be hopeful and believe in yourself. But those will be the demands. People will want things from you,
Yes.
and you can only do what you can. I have a lot of respect for our volunteer sector,
Thank you.
because it is a professional role. It's just that it's
Hmm.
unpaid. But if
Yeah.
you look at Amnesty International, the Red Cross, Salvation Army, probably the bulk of
Mm,
their people are unpaid, but they're
hmm.
there for the cause because
Yes.
they have this vision of the type of society that you want. And
Absolutely.
so, if we get stuck on thinking about the money, then you're probably
Mm,
in the wrong place.
yes. How pay secrecy has allowed women to be underpaid. Years after the Equal Pay Act became the law in 1972. And right now in 2020, we are again talking about the Equal Pay Amendment Bill. So the gender pay principles are applicable to the state sectors already. But how do you think it would play out in the private sector? And how would it be beneficial for employees?
Hmm. So perhaps we could take the questions one at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, the gender pay equity principles, as you say, are now in place for the public sector. Um, and I actually, so that the sector's actually developed a guide of how you would implement that. And when you read it, and you can download the guide from this state sector website, I think there might be now called the public service, because
Mm.
we changed the law just
Okay.
recently. They changed, but it's the same department. And the guide is really quite applicable. It doesn't matter whether you're private or a public sector. And they've had the input from unions, and of course, government services and also non-union workers. So actually, the guide is universal if you look at it. So it's quite transportable, if I can put it in that way. So, for example, one of the principles is around transparency and the accessibility of information.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, talk about pay scales. We're talking about remuneration systems, progression. Because it's one thing to get into a job.
Mm.
The other thing is then you need to progress, because
Yes.
until you progress, our incomes don't improve, and then
Mm.
you don't close the gender pay gap. So for us, I guess ending pay secrecy is probably a fundamental first step to transparency.
Mm.
And by that, to put it very, very simply, what I've asked state services, I said, can you put your pay scale up on every job ad that you put up? Quite a
Okay.
simple thing. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure it doesn't cost a lot of have additional words into an ad. I'm sure they can afford it and have the numbers there. I mean, it's quite a fundamental thing, because what I said to them, if you're a new graduate and you're entering the workspace, if you're a woman who's perhaps taken time off to have a child or raise the children, want to re-enter, you kind of want to know what that role is
Mm.
worth, because then you can pitch for it. Hey, pitch your talent.
Yes.
But it's really hard um, when potential recruits are applying for a job to know whether or not it's the right fit for them. And one of the things that I've also come across is, for some of us who are desperate for work, who've been desperate looking for
Mm.
something, we all can relate to, I can relate to that. When someone makes you an offer, it sounds really good, right?
Yes.
and you just want to jump in, yeah. And they might offer you, I don't know, let's just say, for example, it might offer you 55,000 or 60,000 or more.
Mm.
And it sounds really good when you've had very little to live on. But if they don't tell you the top of the scale is 20 or 30 grand more, that's
Mm.
really unfair. So
Right.
really, it's to be it's to empower people, job seekers, by actually just having that pay scale on the job description.
Mm.
It's different for other roles where on top of that they get bonuses and whatever. It's
Mm.
kind of like, well, that's great, but just fundamentally for any job, at least put the salary scale
Yes.
there. And so then you know when where you're starting, and
Yes.
um, and so so this campaign to end pay secrecy is fundamentally about trying to empower, shift the power from the employers and give some power to the recruit, especially
Mm.
to women, and especially because we know we tend to negotiate not as frequently as the guys. So so it's kind of like, give them knowledge. We know knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power.
So
Yes.
just provide it. Um, and if I mean if if organizations can't pay as much as other organizations, you know, it's just be upfront with it. We like, for example, we know that NGOs cannot pay as much as the state sector,
Mm.
but people love working for the NGOs. They do valuable work. So it's there. So people can make decisions for themselves, but to hide it, to hide the pay scale is almost a purposeful disempowerment strategy, and it doesn't help them. It doesn't help students. It doesn't help anyone trying to re-enter the workforce. So we want it to end, and it's really important.
Absolutely. And like you very correctly said, that people say who are new graduates or new entrants to the industry, they are desperate for any kind of work, and they will say yes, and they are likely to be exploited or are very vulnerable. So, you know, what other things do you think they should keep in mind while applying for jobs, or what kind of advice would you give to them?
Yeah, so my advice, and I give the same advice. I have three children, um, and my advice to them is go in positively. Don't talk about the things you can't do or what
Mm.
you don't have. Talk about what you can do. Because sometimes when you talk like that, your attitude comes out, and
Mm.
employers are looking for your attitude as well as what you bring.
Mm.
The other thing also with the gender pay equity principles is trying to encourage workers to recognize people's life experience,
Mm.
as well as lots of others, like in the voluntary sector,
Correct.
right? Which may or may not be reflected in a qualification that you have.
Mm.
The
Yes.
qualification is only part of actually
Mm.
the package that you bring.
Yes.
All the other experience and your can-do attitude,
Mm.
all of that is your total package. So I say to my kids, don't worry that you've got this qualification, or don't worry that you don't have the qualification. That's only part of what they're looking for.
Mm.
Tell them about all the other things that you bring. So really, really valuable that you sell yourself, that you are positive. I mean, if you've gotten as far as the interview, you're good enough.
Mm.
Always remember that. If you've gotten
Yes.
that far, you're good enough. And then if they make you an offer, ask to see a contract, ask to see the pay scale.
Okay.
And it's completely fair. It's within your rights to do that. And
Mm.
actually, it puts them on their toes. If they're going to take you on,
Yes.
this is the
Yeah.
sort of champion, the
You
sort of
have to
leader
do
that you're
it.
taking on. Do it.
Yeah.
So do
That's
that. And actually in New Zealand, I try to tell this is to our new migrants. Perhaps we've come from cultures where we don't question.
mm.
Actually, in New Zealand,
Absolutely.
it's not a negative thing. It's just called business. That's how you do business. It's not rude or disrespectful. It's expected. So it's
Mm.
okay. You're not
Yes.
upsetting anyone. Ask for it. We're very
Yeah.
courteous and all that sort of stuff, and it's great. But it's expected here. It's
Mm.
just part of doing business. And what you bring is an asset, and you bring that, and the business will benefit from it. So know what you're bringing. So don't be afraid to ask these questions. And they should ask the question. If they don't answer your question, it might, you know, you should think
Yeah.
about, is this the agency you want to go to? Why are you not telling me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hush, hush.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So it's so true because I come from India, and it's high power distance society, and it's a collectivist society where we don't really talk about what the man is getting, what the woman is getting, and it's still a taboo, to be very honest. And
Right.
like talking about it will, like, you always want to save face, you don't want to be like, oh, like too overt kind of when you're discussing all of these.
Yes.
So uh, how do we take these small nuances and this cultural gap, for example, while we're making a policy?
Mm, mm. So the guide that's being produced by the State Services Commission, as I said, any any employer, large or small, can take that guide. So one of the things that they have built in is prompts. It's prompts
Mm,
to agencies that there are cultural differences in terms of how people view authority, how
right.
they view negotiation.
Mhm.
So it's really important for the recruitment people to be sensitive to that.
Okay.
So for example, so I'm thinking, for example, if they make someone an offer
Mhm.
and the person just accepts it, I would be expecting that department to go back and say, do you have any questions? Instead of say, oh, great, he's accepted it. Yeah, let's sign up. Like, because like you say, in your culture and actually in Pacific cultures, it's quite, because there's lots of patriarchy. So
Mm,
challenge to power is not the thing, right?
yes.
And so we have to switch this mindset when
Yeah.
we come to Western society, where
Mm,
you take the power and asking those questions is really important. So it's about trying to build that understanding in businesses that we view these things differently. Speaking rights, for example, right?
mm,
I mean, just because you have a meeting and you're in a meeting doesn't mean that, for example, ethnic minorities will speak. If it's not normal for them to do that, and
yeah.
normally, would expect other people to be your spokesperson.
Yes.
So you're there to support them, not necessarily to speak, right?
Yes. Yes.
So what I tell, especially to businesses I'm talking, if you're talking with, say, for example, some Pacific people and they're not
Mm,
speaking, it's not necessarily that they agree with you. So
mm,
don't take their silence as consent or
absolutely.
agreement. It
Mm.
may be that you're not making any sense, but they don't want to be rude and
Yes.
be
And they
disrespectful.
keep
Yeah,
shut.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you also look each other sideways. What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. So, but, just ask some questions. And if there's silence,
Mm,
just let the silence be. Don't try and fill it. It's because they're trying to process information and then they'll start asking questions. So it's this cultural competency that you talk about, right?
mm,
So
mm,
cultural understanding is and trying to navigate that space between your culture and say a Western culture where the rules are completely different.
mm,
So it's going to be a journey, but as I said, we need to do these things. And of course, looking at New Zealand, looking at Auckland in specific, where I am, so super diverse, and we need to understand each other if we're going to succeed together. Especially, if we're going to welcome in talent like yourself. We've got lots of migrants here. I'm a migrant myself. I came as a child. So if you want to capture that talent, so that everybody prospers, then you need to think differently. You
different.
can't do the same old, or you miss out. But also, you then bring in that unconscious bias that then excludes people and
Mm,
excludes opportunities that should be equal to everybody as we are entitled under our human rights laws, under our local laws. So that unconscious bias has to be untangled. And hopefully it's not going to take us a generation to untangle it.
true.
We need to happen now.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I think it is like so important to empower these sections of society. Say, for example, the colored women and the immigrants and the
Yeah.
basically the underrepresented section. And like we should empower others to solve their own problems, and that's how we would, spread the network, if I may
Yes.
call it.
Yes.
So yes,
Yes.
and that is
Yeah.
so important right now in this day and age where things are
Yeah.
so vulnerable. And
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And sometimes, and this might be an observation on my part, but I find with some of our ethnic minority groups, it's the women that are doing all the advocacy.
mhm.
Um, I'm waiting for our men to make the same amount of noise. It's like, come on, guys, But I mean, it's just an observation. It's really, really interesting. Like in the Pacific communities, I find it's the women who are the outspoken ones, right?
Mm,
And I don't know, perhaps the men are waiting for us to do the speaking, but actually, they need to step up as well.
true.
And so it's really important. So, because often you may have seen this, often we're talking about the gender pay gap, and all
Mm,
the focus is on the women.
on the women, yes.
When we talk about our ethnic minority groups, it's our men also who are
Mm,
being underpaid and unequally paid and not getting access to opportunities and not progressing. So the picture for us is different. And
mm,
so we have to work together as communities to address these inequities beyond gender. It's about everybody. And it's really important we don't leave our brothers behind, eh?
yes.
Yeah,
And all the more right now we're trying to make society more inclusive and more equitable. So of
yeah,
course we just can't leave the men behind,
yeah,
because they are part of our society.
yeah,
So
yeah.
men and
We're,
women
yeah,
together have to do what we have to do in order to make
yeah.
society good and better.
Yes,
So
absolutely. And so it's really important that whoever, whether it's the brother or the sister that climbs the ladder, that they make space for the rest of us to climb. Because
so true.
sometimes that doesn't happen.
Mm,
We assume that, that when we climb the ladder, that it paves the way, makes it easier, for other brothers and sisters to come through. But
mm,
that doesn't always happen. So there is a responsibility for people from our ethnic minority communities when they reach positions where they're making decisions, with leading organizations, or they're in human resources departments,
mm,
that they do their best to train up their colleagues to think differently and to create pathways, for others when they reach those positions,
mm.
and not to be the obstacle for others to come through. It's really important.
So my final question for you today would be that, you've been the EEO commissioner since 2018. And so what has been the most attractive part or most attractive element about your role? And if you could also share your biggest challenge till
Mm,
date.
mm. Well, I think one of the assets of the role is that you have access to people who make decisions. So you have access to CEOs, you have access to cabinet ministers, members of parliament, access to leaders. So you you kind of use yourself as a bridge for voices like yourself. You tell me things, I can then communicate that. So you see yourself as being in a useful position to
Mm.
to be the bridge for the voices to get to those making decisions. They don't always agree with you, and that's fine, but you have the permission to be disruptive. So as we talked about before, we've been raised to keep the peace, to endure too much. In this role, you're given permission. In fact, it's your task to be disruptive, to say the things that make other people feel uncomfortable. Otherwise, there's no progress, right?
Correct.
So for me, that's a really powerful part of the role. And you don't have to have all the answers, because you're not responsible for fixing it.
Mm.
Everyone is responsible for ensuring the human rights of all of our people. Whether you're a student or a child or someone working, it doesn't matter in this society. We have these human rights conventions we've signed up to. We have our own laws around equality, freedom from discrimination. So it's everyone's duty to do it. So I don't feel like I have to know everything.
Mm.
When you're at varsity, you get exam,
Yeah.
you feel like you got to know everything. In real life, you don't have to know everything, but you got to be really good at making connections and telling the story without diluting the message. So it's almost like a communication role. But yes, I have the permission to upset people.
Make some
Upset
noise.
waters, make
Yeah.
some noise. It's my job to make the noise, not necessarily to fix the problem, but to make a loud noise,
Mm,
so that you're heard. Because we're in minorities, we can make as much noise, but as we spoke, before,
mm.
if you're in that 20%, you're not going to be heard. So we've got to find ways to get the voice of the 20% out. It's really
So true.
important. Mm,
So true. And
mm.
I mean, like just by talking to you, I feel empowered right now. I mean, I can feel, oh, let me do it. I've got
Go
that.
pick a fight.
Yeah. Suddenly I have the superpower
That's right.
to do
Absolutely.
anything that I want to.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Good on
Yes.
you. Good on you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, it was such a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for your time and the
No,
beautiful
thank you.
insights that you've
Thank you.
provided to us on such a crucial topic, because you know this topic needs more and more reflection, not just pay transparency, but all the things that we discussed about today.
Mm,
And because only through discussions like this and critical thinking that we just did right now can we spread more awareness and
yeah.
make society a better place to live in.
Yeah. No. Keep
Yes.
doing what you're doing. It's really
Thank you so
important.
much. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. It was such a nice time talking to you, Dr. Karanina. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste. Have a wonderful day ahead.